the last module, which is on globalization, or the relationship of governance to the global. And here we have to ask the question, what does a post-state look like? What does a post-state look like? And a post-state would mean that we give up on the idea of the Leviathan. We give up on the idea of a central, all-powerful, engaging entity, and instead ask the question, is it possible to think about our ways of being collectively, coherently, and fairly through alternative democratic processes? Now, this is a strange request, to be sure, because it implies that we can, in fact, be successful without this Hobbesian guardian, so to speak, that we term the state. And yet, we have enough evidence to show that there is no special coordinating feature of this entity. Perhaps, yes, to provide the rule of law, to establish the rule of law, to provide law and order, establish institutions of organizing our lives, all of that. And yet, the consequences of giving into the particular sovereign elite powers is that they do at least two things that I consider significant to democratic freedoms. One is that they organize through their modes of governance, their modes of governmentality, structures of sovereign power that extend down to the very household. We have seen the state and the family, as Althusser calls the family, the ultimate ideological state apparatus. It's a beautiful phrase. And I have read his essay on ISAs, as he calls them, but I think I've more fully grasped what he was after only after I've read relevant passages from his autobiography, The Future Lasts Forever. Okay, that's an aside. But the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that this post-state is a way of imagining other ideological apparatuses maybe, but still that are not explicitly with the recognizable modes of sovereign power, of elite networks associated with sovereign power, the forms of rent-seeking, the growth of private wealth at the expense of the public good, R greater than G. All of those kinds of organizational elements seem to go hand in hand with all patterns of state formation. I've already mentioned the socialist state, which was supposed to be an escape from this, reproducing those very same structures. I've mentioned this in the case of particularly of Russia, although we didn't do a reading in that connection. We haven't spent any time at all in this course talking about political parties. But in the contemporary period, political parties are the means and the mechanisms through which wealth gets organized around leadership, wealth and power, and centralizing nodes in networks, forming these elite networks, get established, and through that, you have the reproduction of certain relationships and elements. Most clearly seen in the current politics of the Republican Party in the United States. If you trace its history for the past 30 years, you can see that. Many political scientists have pointed to the Congress Party post-Indira in particular, and how that morphed into this kind of clientelism. You see it in many other parts of the world. So this is no secret, okay? I'm not revealing something new by saying that almost all state structures, as we understand them, are corrupt. The ensuing question is, what are alternatives to this system? What democratizing forms can we envision that are different from this mode of political formations? We are talking about territorial entities again, right? So the notion of land being at the center of this, control over surpluses as being, these are all legacy issues. Modern human society has emerged out of Neolithic settlement camps some 10,000 years ago. So we are still bound to land-related forms of territoriality, and yet I suspect we are at the cusp of something transformative taking place at this very moment with the development of virtual space. Already the internet spaces of the internet are being captured, are being controlled, rents are being collected from them. Take, for example, a company like Amazon. What is it really doing? It is basically keeping track of buyers and sellers. It's a portal to keep buyers and sellers in touch with each other. And of course, it has its own, logistics and warehousing operations and so on, sort of try and make these connections easier. But all of these are essentially gatekeeping functions out of which Amazon creates rent, and through that rent has grown enormously wealthy, but in the process is also creating enclosures within internet spaces. And this is now becoming legion, and the whole fight over net neutrality, very interesting. From a future historical perspective, this will be a kind of a landmark democratizing struggle before virtual space is also captured by elite interests, by strategic forms of power whose very formation and success is dependent on the reproduction of cultural structures. Societies in the formation help to maintain and build up these forms of elite capture. And that's something that I suspect needs far greater investigation and exploration. And yet, I think it's happening on multiple fronts, but it needs also to be more systematic, I think. Not just the Thomas Piketty who needs to understand and identify these types of formation. Capital and Ideology, quite a landmark book in this respect. I've only read little bits and pieces of it. It's a very large book, but I can already tell that there's a lot of detail in the way in which white-collar crime is being identified and exposed through a book like Capital and Ideology. The question is, if you accept this premise that the contemporary territorial state is no better, in spite of a lot of improvement through accountability, voice and exit to a lesser extent, but at least voice, as Albert O. Hirschman points out. He has a book called Loyalty, Voice and Exit, or the other way around, Exit, Voice and Loyalty, but in which he describes those as fundamental to social orders, social fulfillment, not order in just maintaining the maintenance of order, but to leading fulfilled human lives. You need the ability to have some voice. You need some kind of accountability on the part of those who govern you, those who claim to have legitimate authority over you, and you need the ability to leave if necessary. Right? So the modern Republican state, through its institutions, its accountability, they're constituted that way. And we need to pay attention to those elements of that democracy in the making, republicanism. But it seems, for a variety of reasons, it seems timely to start thinking about cosmopolitan forms of social fulfillment. And the modes of governmentality, because we do need structured forms of reason to rule ourselves. The term that comes to mind is the right to justification. Rainer Forst uses this phrase to say that we have the right to make claims on each other. So that and that's a sort of a negative way of thinking about it, but even in positive terms, that we can build through modes of solidarity, what Escobar, Ashish Kotari and others have been calling the pluriverse. So look up these phrases. We will have some occasion to read selections from these terms as well. But what I'm suggesting is already we have various interesting and a range of such options, various ways of thinking about the alternative, or thinking about a pluriverse of alternatives. So this week, while we're shifting the perspective towards the global, we begin by looking at some of these processes of globalization. Is there some kind of governance taking place at the global level? If so, who is affected? What sorts of global governance do you have? What levels of them? And who is being governed? Who needs to be governed? What types of relationships do the most dominant players have at the global scale? So these are some of the questions we're starting with this week. And next week, we'll take a different turn, trying to understand other modes of global governance, alternatives, if you like. So here we have this annual review again, Transnational Corporations and Global Governance, Tim Bartley. Take a look at the keywords: globalization, political sociology, neoliberalism, corporate social responsibility. A lot of themes that seem incongruous but woven together in this lovely review. So the abstract says, scholars and critics often lament that corporations rule the world, but predominant accounts of global governance imply almost the opposite. With theories populated by national governments and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, it might appear that nearly everyone except corporations writes the rules that govern across borders. This article compiles research on the varied ways in which multinational and transnational corporations have shaped global governance, drawing attention to the contours and limits of corporate power. Corporations can be seen variously as sponsors, inhibitors, and direct providers of global governance. They have, for example, been sponsors of neoliberal trade rules, inhibitors of some labor and environmental regimes, and providers of private standards for finance, safety, sustainability, and human rights. Scholars may be tempted to focus on just one of these roles or to presume unified corporate dominance, but it is important to grapple with all three and to investigate the conditions under which corporate actions are more or less unified and decisive. So he starts off by saying the rise of transnational corporations has challenged national forms of regulation, shifted governments' trade and fiscal priorities, and spawned new forms of private authority. Yet, corporations are rarely in the foreground in theories of global governance. And so he goes on to talk about how idealist, realist, constructivist, all of these theories of international governance really don't talk about transnational corporations and their role in governance. On the other hand, in political sociology, there has been a long tradition on corporations and public policy, but these are all mostly confined to the national scale. Drawing from research on a range of subfields and topics. I argue that corporations have played three main roles in the drama of global governance: sponsor, inhibitor, and provider. First, multinational and transnational corporations have actively sponsored and partially devised some international regimes. This is clearest in the global rise of neoliberalism and its institutionalization in trade agreements. Second, corporations have inhibited the expansion of global governance in other arenas, mobilizing to defeat or defang rules pertaining to labor, environment, and health and safety, for instance. Third, corporations have become direct providers of global governance, as seen in the rise of transnational governance and private regulation. Here, corporations are not pushing for or against intergovernmental agreements, but rather pushing private standards for safety, sustainability, technical specifications, and human rights through their global supply chains. Global governance, I mean sets of relatively formalized rules, standards, agreements, and/or administrative bodies that seek to establish order and solve problems across numerous national jurisdictions. While some equate global governance with nearly all forms of international and transnational ordering, my more restricted definition is helpful for organizing a diverse literature and clarifying key processes of corporate influence. Global governance was never as state-centered as the literature would make it seem, but it has become especially important to focus on TNCs. The rise of global value chains has enabled companies to coordinate production across national borders while keeping their high-value design and marketing activities in affluent countries, or perhaps in offshore tax havens. This transnational structure of production is one reason why intergovernmental approaches face new challenges, and why activities have turned to the private sector for reforms, making global value chains into infrastructures for the flow of rules. Analytically, there is growing interest in moving beyond methodological nationalism in macrosociology. Methodological nationalism is a takeoff on methodological individualism. I hope you know what the latter means as well. States and national boundaries remain essential, but we would also not let a nationalist data infrastructure with governments as cases define the research agenda. So we know, of course, that the earliest corporations were transnational in the form of colonial trading companies, such as the Dutch East India and English East India companies. But the rise of the integrated industrial corporation in the 19th and early 20th centuries happened mainly within national borders, producing powerhouses such as US Steel, General Motors, Renault, and Siemens. By the mid-20th century, many companies had expanded their foreign investments to become MNCs, and we have some familiar names there. Scholars of international business have typically theorized multinational expansion as a way for large firms to exploit the capabilities they have developed at home or protect their market positions as product cycles make domestic manufacturing uncompetitive. American banks followed their clients abroad in the 1960s and 70s until the third world debt crisis and the wave of consolidation left just a handful of highly globalized financial companies. Increasingly, global firms have taken the form of networked TNCs, which have extensive global reach but much more limited foreign investments. As unwieldy global conglomerates collapsed and financial markets pushed firms to shed all but their core competencies, the supply chain revolution made it possible for many industries to rely more on global sourcing than on joint ventures. So you see many companies doing that: Nike, Apple, Walmart, IKEA, etc. So MNCs are associated with FDI, or foreign direct investment, and that's usually associated with economic growth, even though there's also evidence that it increases inequality. While quantitative research sought to infer the effects of corporations, you also start to have a number of ethnographic, detailed investigations of what happened to individual MNCs. So the early users of the word governance primarily meant the coordination of supply chains rather than the structuring of political authority. Nevertheless, it's notable that those scholars were also among the first to draw attention to the rise of private global standards, So the formation of global associations, much like trading networks from the medieval period, and their formation of rules and these new forms of governance were important. Similarly, in the contemporary period, networks of TNCs and their rules of private global standards becomes quite significant. Then there's also a lot of research that uses this idea, the structural idea of a transnational capitalist class. Only rarely have scholars in this tradition tried to assess whether structural ties generate unified political action. In one recent contribution, Murray connects transnational interlocks with contributions by corporate political action committees or PACs in the United States. While banks have lost their role as unifying agents in the American corporate community, Murray finds evidence that other types of interlocks and transnational ties, especially to an inner circle of internationally connected corporate directors, are associated with unity in the PAC contributions of the world's largest companies. So I want you to try and recollect the image of this bow tie structure in transnational networks. Is a very familiar arrangement here, and the inner circle becomes especially key. Rather than investigating processes of mobilization or the exercise of structural power, the transnational capitalist class literature relies on a Marxist style of functionalism. Because the transnationalist capitalist class needs supranational organizations to manage crises, a transnational state composed of the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, WTO, and other organizations has arisen to fulfill the needs. So that's the Marxist understanding of the transnational capitalist class. But he says this is obviously insufficient if one wants sociological explanations to account for processes, mechanisms, sequencing, or paths not taken. In reviewing evidence about corporations as sponsors, inhibitors, and providers and global governance, I seek to highlight processes of influence as much as possible. So he talks about TNCs as sponsors. So what are they sponsors of? Principally of the neoliberal project. While some might suspect that TNCs are averse to global rules, they've been enthusiastic supporters and architectures of some types of rules, even of stringent enforcement by governments and intergovernmental organizations. This can be seen most clearly in the construction of neoliberalism, that is, a set of ideas and policies focused on removing barriers to international trade, expanding the reach of markets, and reducing democratic intrusion into market operations. There is a burgeoning sociological literature on neoliberalism, but it has taken a decidedly political and cultural turn. Some scholars emphasize governments and international financial institutions that have pushed privatization, trade openness, and other liberal reforms. Others might highlight communities of intellectuals behind the neoliberal project, from the Mount Pelerin Society of Libertarian Intellectuals to the networks of economists puzzling over planning. These accounts are important, but they should not obscure the role that corporations have played in the construction of neoliberalism, particularly at the global level. When we say that corporations were involved in setting the rules or involved in creating an agenda for international trade, which is what you would expect them to do, it's very important to bear in mind that this was actually a very small group of companies. This wasn't the proliferation of Schumpeterian, an explosion of competitive entities that were trying to do this. A handful of companies, in fact, 12 corporations made public law for the world, Sell argues, referring to the CEOs of 12 American companies, including General Electric, DuPont, Monsanto, Merck, and Procter & Gamble, who had essentially devised WTO's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS, which, as we know, has been a very, very important, very significant piece of international legislation that has caused a large number of entrepreneurs and entities around the world to be severely disaffected by TRIPS. Even while it has been argued that it protects every individual entrepreneur's patent laws and copyright and so on, or their right to private property. So that's the discursive apparatus that seems to justify this, but the actual rules were written only by a dozen or so individuals and lawyers. So just because MNCs are prominent sponsors in the global arena doesn't mean that they always get their way, partly because of the interplay of multiple forces. Beyond trade agreements, there are a variety of examples of corporations sponsoring and shaping intergovernmental regimes. An elite club of experts, the Group of 30, has helped financial corporations globalize their preferred versions of securities and derivatives regulation. The club, which brings together the leaders of large financial corporations, together with academic experts, central bankers, and public sector officials, has produced agenda-setting studies and best practice standards that were taken up by intergovernmental bodies such as the International Organizations of Securities Commissions and the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. International regulatory bodies take the lead of industry associations formulating rules. Apart from sponsorship, the second type of role that Bartley sees in global governance for transnational corporations is as inhibitors. And this is a major role that we see often, that we're familiar with. In trade, labor, and human rights, TNCs have endorsed voluntary principles on business and human rights, but they have worked to derail instruments that might include binding penalties or extended legal liabilities. And again, he gives a series of examples on how this might work. And then similarly, on climate change, environmental policy, and prospects for compromise, it is also clear that American corporations have mobilized to inhibit a strong intergovernmental response to climate change. And for those of you who have any remaining doubts about this, see this film, this wonderful film by Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt. ExxonMobil, for instance, knew about climate change 30 years or 25 years at least before they admitted that climate change was a problem caused by fossil fuels. Until then, they did everything they could to sponsor various types of organizations that were actively lying about the effects of carbon dioxide and calling the whole thing a hoax. Competition and content, another way in which they inhibit. Whether companies will inhibit or strategically support globalization of rules seems also to depend on the content of the rule itself. Callahan argues that companies will sometimes seek to globalize the rules that they already live with domestically in order to level the playing field and constrain their neighbor. But this leveling potential may not be enough. She shows how British companies supported European Union directives that reduced managers' ability to resist corporate takeovers, since they already faced this risk and saw the potential to acquire companies elsewhere in the European Union. German companies derided the directives as neoliberal infringements on their autonomy and opposed them, but when it came to EU directives on worker participation, German and British companies were united in opposition, even though German firms already had high levels of worker participation through co-determination. So trying to find the least common denominator to ease their rules was also a way in which companies inhibited globalization of some rules. And then finally, as providers, the rise of private authority, this is also a new form of governance through the association of various TNCs. TNCs have become direct providers of global governance, covering issues from finance to food safety to environmental justice and labor rights. This is described in burgeoning multidisciplinary literatures on global private authority, transnational private regulation, voluntary sustainability standards, and corporate social responsibility. So these are ways in which corporations are creating the very rules of global governance. So in finance, this is very prominent. Global financial markets would seemingly be inoperable without private forms of governance. Rating agencies such as Moody's and Standard & Poor's essentially regulate the debt of corporations as well as national and municipal governments. Researchers have paid particular attention to the rise of global accounting standards. Professionals bodies formed an International Accounting Standards Committee in 1973 after several failed attempts to harmonize accounting methods through intergovernmental arenas. The so-called Big Four accounting firms, which are the Big Four accounting firms? Deloitte, KPMG, Ernst Young, and PwC. The Big Four accounting firms took on an especially central role, contributing roughly 60% of financial support and having former executives in 4 of the 12 seats of the governing board. Yet the IASB standards veer more towards an Anglo-American world. Boyter and Matley find that American firms have the greatest influence over the IASB. Similarly, on global food safety, studies of global food systems point to the rise of large supermarkets as the de facto regulators of quality, safety, and sustainability in agricultural operations around the world. So while WTO negotiations on agriculture have stagnated, private actors have become the key players in governing global agriculture. The concentration of food retailing, especially in Europe and increasingly the United States as well, means that companies such as Carrefour, Tesco, and Walmart have a tremendous amount of power over suppliers. And the growth of private label brands and direct sourcing means that there are fewer intermediaries between supermarkets and farmers around the world. So the high cost of standards can marginalize small producers, but there is also evidence of producers coping with and leveraging food safety standards. Perez Almond shows how dairy cooperatives in Nicaragua learned new food safety systems and upgraded their capacities. And Kozlowski shows how Bolivian firms use food safety standards to become dominant producers of so-called Brazil nuts. For governments in the global south, the food safety standards imposed by dominant companies, importing countries, and the WTO have scientized risk management in complex and perhaps contradictory ways. And finally, this is a domain where large NGOs and transnational corporations are directly involved in a kind of a historic battle at the global scale. Large supermarkets have been essential to the rise of sustainability standards and mainstreaming of organic and fair trade certification. The highly concentrated supermarket sector in the United Kingdom made it a prime target for anti-GMO activists and led to GMOs being effectively banned in the British market through the policies that retailers adopted. The more fragmented supermarket sector in the United States, in contrast, proved much less receptive. So it's a very interesting way in which this is something called the logic of collective action that I will talk about briefly in the next discussion. But this seems to be a way in which this worked very interestingly in an inverse sort of way. In broad terms, environmental non-governmental organizations have used a combination of activist campaigns, corporate partnerships, and public scorecards to convince large retailers and manufacturers to support sustainability standards and join multi-stakeholder initiatives in which NGOs also have a seat at the table. Walmart and McDonald's agreed to promote certification to the Marine Stewardship Council standards for seafood, for instance, while Nestle and L'Oreal promised to get suppliers certified to the standards of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. But it turns out that many of these initiatives, even the most credible multi-stakeholder initiatives, rely on the participation and even leadership of large companies at times. The companies like IKEA, B&Q, and Stora Enso to promote and sometimes subsidize the certification of forest management operations, something that the Forest Stewardship Council has attempted and done so successfully. TNCs have also become direct providers of global labor standards and purported protectors of human rights. Following a wave of anti-sweatshop activism in the late 1990s, apparel, footwear, and toy brands in North America and Europe adopted codes of conduct or ethical sourcing policies for their global supply chains and began monitoring compliance, sometimes with help from auditing firms or multi-stakeholder initiatives. And then, of course, much research has focused on the rise of global corporate social responsibility, its market and political underpinnings, and a debate about whether it is predominantly a reflection of neoliberalism or an extension of prior forms of institutionalized social solidarity. So there's some interesting literature around this. To the extent that researchers have looked at these rules on the ground, they have often found low quality auditing, evasion by suppliers, weak enforcement of collective rights, and poor coverage of subcontractors. A growing body of research is identifying some conditions under which compliance is more plausible and several pathways to improvement, but nearly always with the constraints of TNC's demand for low prices and quick deliveries. In recent work by Bartley himself, I have compared land and labor standards as implemented in Indonesia and China, finding that both fair labor and sustainable forestry standards are of limited significance and are altered by the domestic context, but that labor standards have been especially troubled. So why would TNCs be providers of global governance in this manner? First, the primary purpose of rules may be either to coordinate or restrict markets. Market coordinating rules seek to harmonize divergent national approaches and thus expand markets as seen in accounting, quality, and technical standards. Market restricting rules seek to limit activities that might be profitable but that would expose consumers, workers, or residents to serious hazards, as seen in product safety, labor, and environmental standards. TNCs usually have a strong interest in market coordinating standards. They often get enmeshed in conflicts about whose standards should be globalized, but they rarely question whether global standards are desirable. TNC's interests in market restricting standards, however, tend to be indirect and defensive. Firms would prefer more autonomy, but they recognize in some circumstances that standards may help them manage risks to their reputations and market positions. Second question relating to product or production process. And again, here there are multiple ways in which for rules that focus on the production process, the hazards of non-compliance largely stay near the point of production. In hazardous workplaces, polluted local environments, and degraded landscapes, for example, here TNCs may have an interest in minimizing bad publicity and protecting their brands, but given the distant and indirect links to the possible damage, this interest can easily be trumped by other priorities. Crossing these two dimensions, it's not hard to see why TNCs have adopted but not always vigorously enforced market restricting rules focused on the production process. For example, labor and sustainability standards. Stringent enforcement would reduce a company's autonomy, and the risk management benefits would be comparatively fuzzy and distant. TNCs tend to take a stronger interest when market restricting rules are focused on the products themselves, as with product safety standards. These still reduce corporate autonomy, but also help to manage potentially direct and severe risks. So what are the implications of this research? That it's important to try and pay attention to the multiple roles that corporations can play as sponsor, inhibitor, and provider, and that it's important, of course, for researchers to be cautious about focusing on one role without recognizing the others. Second, it should be clear that corporations are important and privileged players in the global governance arenas, but do not fully control them. Some corporate mobilizations to shape the WTO, for instance, have succeeded, but others have fallen short. Companies have helped to defeat or cripple some intergovernmental treaties, but in other cases have had to accept significant compromises. Second, it should be clear that corporations are important and privileged players in global governance arenas, but do not fully control them. Some corporate mobilizations to shape the WTO, for instance, have succeeded, while others have fallen short. Several hints in the existing literature about when and how corporations gain the upper hand. CEO groups seem to be more flexible and effective than traditional industry associations. In other words, smaller and tighter the group that's trying to effect large change, the more likely that it's going to have a strong influence on effecting that change. Similarly, oligopolistic industries may be especially capable of defanging or redirecting proposed rules, but also more likely to accept compromises. Third, substance matters. As discussed above, the content of a rule-making project appears to influence whether companies will treat it as an opportunity to level the playing field against foreign competitors or as an industry-wide or class-wide threat to be defeated. In addition, the content of rules that is, whether they coordinate or restrict markets and pertain to products or production processes, seems to shape the depth of companies' investment in providing global rules themselves. Finally, it is worthwhile asking whether the roles rub off. For instance, do corporations who have embraced the private provision of global governance become more likely than their competitors to support stringent and binding government regulation and intergovernmental agreements? On the one hand, there are some hints that they might. So Nike broke with the American Chamber of Commerce in not opposing China's labor contract law of 2007. And Carrefour, B&Q, and IKEA supported the EU timber regulation of 2010, which penalizes the sale of illegally harvested forest products. Perhaps private governance is helping to create a new global corporate liberal bloc that will do less to impede intergovernmental rules for environment, labor, and consumer safety. On the other hand, there's also evidence that companies that embrace voluntary provision of global governance will resist even seemingly minor moves toward legal obligation. The EU's non-financial reporting directive merely mandates particular forms of sustainability and corporate social responsibility reporting for large publicly traded firms. IKEA and Unilever, two firms central to global private governance, publicly supported it, but hundreds of other firms that engaged in voluntary reporting nevertheless fought against this mandate, ultimately weakening the law's substance and scope. So what we have here is an essay by Richard Woodward, Governance in a Globalized World, and Woodward here is trying to explain global governance in a more expanded, wider sense than the way in which Bartley did in the previous paper. Throughout the 20th century, mainstream social sciences proceeded from the premise that human activities corresponded with the territorial boundaries of sovereign states. We've already seen this on numerous occasions. The privileging of sovereign territoriality by sociologists, economists, and political scientists did not reflect a poverty of scholarly thinking, but was a byproduct of the social world that they inhabited. From the 17th century onwards, that is, ever since that image of Leviathan appeared as a frontispiece in Hobbes's infamous book, the state's role steadily outgrew the domain of security to encompass commercial, cultural, and social responsibilities. By the middle of the 20th century, in advanced industrialized countries at least, state power had infiltrated the everyday lives of citizens to an unprecedented degree. This is also, if you recall, what Max Weber termed the iron cage of rationality. Meanwhile, at the international level, the Cold War backcloth of two nuclear-armed superpowers poised at the brink of mutual annihilation underscored the view that states constituted the most powerful actors on the world stage. So the Cold War only simply accentuated, enlarged the power and potency and might and very existence of the state. And yet, paradoxically, it was the development of nuclear weapons, perhaps the most potent symbol of the state's power, that instigated a debate about its possible obsolescence. ICBM technology enabled states to obliterate each other from a distance. The absence of effective devices to intercept them meant states could not fulfill their elementary mission of guaranteeing the security of their citizens through maintaining their territorial integrity. So, pretty profound philosophical point. And then, of course, you had other effects of globalization. In the following decade, Charles Kindleberger's remark that the state is just about over as an economic unit was another foretaste of transformations afoot in the social world. The amplified intensity, extensity, and velocity of cross-border movements of trade, capital production, people, pollution, violence, and culture, encapsulated by the portmanteau term globalization, seemed to dispute the state-centered social ontology of the social sciences. So Woodward goes on to describe the great anxiety and uneasiness that emerged within IR theory around its methodological territorialism. I mean, IR theory was built upon this notion that states are independent units, the units of interrelationship that we need to investigate. But throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the sentiment that governance was tantamount to government was already at odds with the world undergoing a technological revolution in information and communications, diffusing power away from governments and empowering individuals and groups to play roles in world politics, including wreaking massive destruction that were once reserved for governments of states. This is Joseph Nye. Apprehension about the shortcomings of analysis that overlooked or marginalized non-state actors stimulated a series of analytical innovations in IR, work on transnational relations, Keohane and Nye, interdependence, same authors, and international regimes, Stephen Krasner, each assigned a more prominent role to non-state actors. So even in trying to model analytically interstate relationship, the non-state actors and those elements started to gain prominence. Ultimately, of course, they got caught up in their own contradictions of privileging state as the principal actor. Despite the delusion of literature and globalization, commentators are no nearer an agreement on precisely what the phenomenon means. The intention here in this chapter is to conjecture about what, if any, implications globalization has for our understanding of governance and whether it obliges social scientists to discard the spatial blinkers of methodological territorialism. At the other extreme is hyperglobalism, this kind of idea that the earth is flat, that there is no difference anywhere, and that misses several important elements. Nevertheless, hyperglobalism provided new vocabularies around subnational, transnational, and supranational conditions. It's now useful to think about globalization, where globalization concludes that states endure as significant containers of power, authority, and governance. Nevertheless, there is a lot more going on among and within these state-like entities. A turbulent world governed by a complex cast of ceaselessly changing performers that embraces but is not reducible to the state. Better to think about any particular location as being in the middle of this flux of performances. So while you don't write out the state, non-state actors are no longer seen as mere pawns on a state-dominated chessboard, but to be the possessors of political power and authority that supplement and occasionally supplant the state. And so here Woodward covers some of the same features that were covered by Bartley around standards and associations and so on, voluntary forms of governance and international financial architecture, etc. And here looks at different frameworks of global governance. We come to multi-level governance, trans-governmental networks, and neo-medievalism. So what is multi-level governance? Multi-level governance began life as a way of interrogating the dispersal of decision-making competencies across different tiers of government in the European Union, but has since been invoked more widely to describe, explain, and understand governance in a globalized world. Multi-level governance pertains to the simultaneous mobilization of public authorities at different jurisdictional levels. Typically, models of multi-level governance envisage public authorities stacked in the club sandwich style arrangement outlined in figure 18.1. What is figure 18.1? This is what it looks like. And the principle here is called subsidiarity. So the type of level of governance that you have at subnational or national or regional or international applies to the conditions that are most appropriate to that scale or that level. Models of multi-level governance sometimes declare that levels are cohesive entities constructed of homogeneous actors. If the state level is selected as an example, such certainties swiftly evaporate. Okay. Then you have trans-governmental networks. In the aftermath of 9/11 terrorist attacks, the foremost attention was reserved for the recruitment of states to a coalition prepared to prosecute the idiosyncratic war on terror. Just as vital, if less acknowledged, were the networks of police, border and intelligence agencies, and financial regulators that scrambled to exchange information on and detain suspects and to freeze and sequester their assets. So Anne-Marie Slaughter's term disaggregated sovereignty is at work here, and I will hope that you try, and certainly some of you, I will hope that some of you pursue this in your own research. It's a very interesting concept. And then finally, neo-medievalism. Neo-medievalism surmises that the world is going back to the future because rather than the orderly agglomeration of collective interests suggested by Westphalian geography, today's world again resembles the crisscrossing and competing fiefdoms emblematic of the period of medieval Christendom. Jumbled boundaries and fissured loyalties are thought to jeopardize sovereignty, reducing the state to just one actor among many. Today, billions of people live in blissful ignorance of who their sovereign rulers are, with many answering to tribal elders, feudal landlords, mercenary commanders, religious leaders, or corporate executives. Another way of talking about this is legal pluralism, that multiple frameworks of law, of who's in charge, can operate simultaneously in the same location. The benefit of this perspective is that it conveys the fluidity and messiness of the prevailing landscape, with many things subject synchronously to several authority structures. Furthermore, by suggesting that territory is no longer the sole organizing principle for governance, neo-medievalism is able to better account for the private sovereignty-free sources of power and authority. Then, of course, the problem with taking the neo-medieval slant overstates the changes in a manner so there's also a tendency for hyperbole in this framework, in this type of understanding of global governance. Richard Woodward says many leading pundits judge that state-centered notions of politics appear to account for less and less of contemporary patterns of power and authority in an era of globalization. This chapter has argued that globalization confronts directly the national-centered script dramatized by 20th century's political scientists. Cartographers charting the changing contours of global governance increasingly agree that while the power and authority of states provide prominent coordinates, they should not define the map.